Thank you. All right. No, I'm not able actually to see the notes, but that's fine. Okay, so thank you very much for your attention. I'm going to present from a more analytic, scholastic perspective. So just a heads up that I'm not a historian. I'm very interested in the history of metaphysics and mathematics and their interaction. But if anybody has feedback from a historical perspective or any corrections, I would welcome that. All right, so the central question that I am dealing with is how it is possible for the finite to think the infinite. So, well, we are beings with finite brains and sense organs who might well live in a spatio-temporally bounded world. And it seems odd that we are able to have a concept that reaches out, as it were, to the unbounded. In this presentation, my goal was to clearly pose the paradox of infinitary thought and to argue that there is as yet no materialistic, non-exotic solution that is on offer to the paradox. This said, I will conclude the presentation by gesturing towards how classical or Aristotelian metaphysics and psychology might contribute to a solution. The first section of my presentation aims to clearly formulate the paradox. I will explain first what I mean by infinitude, then I will discuss an assumption I'm making about the nature of thought that is needed in order to make sense of the paradox, and then I will state the paradox. So, first, on the notion of the infinite, I will follow A.W. Moore in suggesting that there are two broad classes of infinitude that have tended to be of interest to philosophers. The first is the sort of infinitude discussed in mathematics. So, for example, in set theory. I shall call this the extensive notion of infinitude. The extensively infinite, whether it's actual or potential, is something that is very like a very large number or a very large collection of divisible units, that is, units that can be divided from one another. Now, the second sort of infinitude that Moore and myself gesture towards is that discussed in theology or in metaphysics, as when one claims, for example, that God is in some sense infinite. I shall call this the notion of the intensively infinite. Some people might also call it the qualitatively or metaphysically infinite. Something is intensively infinite if it has the sort of indivisible magnitude that is not that does not involve the composition of discrete units and that is not measured in discrete units of quantity. This sort of infinitude tends to mark something as qualitatively superior to something else in some order or series, especially in as much as this mode of superiority involves unifying or explaining the perfections or magnitudes of inferior members of the order or series. I will discuss this notion of the intensively infinite in more detail later. In the meantime, though, presume that I'm speaking of the extensively infinite in formulating the paradox. For the paradox of infinitary thought first arises in relation to this notion of infinitude. I turn to my assumption about thought that is needed in order to make sense of the paradox. I take it that thought involves intentionality. When we think of some object in a broad sense of object, whether this object of thought be mathematical, fictional, non-existent, universal, particular, theological, scientific, or whatever else. Given this assumption that thought has an object, it seems quite reasonable to suppose that there must be an explanation as to why any given thought has its particular object rather than another, or why a given entity is a thinker that has objects of thought in the first place. Consider that when I think about the planet Jupiter, there is presumably some fact about the world other than the simple intentional fact that my thought is about Jupiter that explains how and why I am thinking about Jupiter, and not about a similar planet elsewhere or about nothing at all. So, with this said, what might constitute a minimally sufficient explanation or reason why a given thought intends a specific object, or why a given entity is a thinker of thought? I will assume, following many philosophers of mind, that a necessary, albeit not necessarily a sufficient, condition for thought is that at least one of the following two conditions be satisfied. Either A, there must be some suitable causal relation between the thinker and the object of thought, or B, the thinker must possess some representation of the object that is qualitatively similar enough to the object in such a way as to uniquely pick it out and stand for it. I will call this condition for thinking the disjunctive condition for cognition, or DCC. Given the DCC, we may now clearly formulate the paradox of infinitary thought. The paradox of infinitary thought is that each of the following propositions seems to be true, where these propositions are not consistent with one another. Proposition 1, we can think of the infinite. Proposition 2, if we can think of the infinite, then we are either causally related to something infinite in a suitable fashion, or we have a mental representation that in some respect resembles the infinite uniquely. Proposition 3, we are neither causally related to the infinite in a suitable fashion, nor do we have a mental representation that in any respect uniquely resembles the infinite. I will assume for the rest of this presentation that we in fact can think the infinite, and thus that the first proposition is not in dispute. One of the other two propositions will have to be denied or refined. But I will argue in the following two sections that no attempt so far to deny or refine either of these propositions has been successful. I will divide responses to the paradox into two classes. One, the straightforward kind of response, and then a more nuanced sort of response. I will first offer and critique some straightforward attempts to satisfy the DCC. The first sort of attempt appeals to our apparent perceptions of infinite things and sense experience. The second to the infinite things postulated in science in order to explain the empirical world. And the last to speculative infinitudes that might exist in the brain. So first, I've noticed that when I pose the paradox, some have been tempted to point to our perceptual experiences that seem to invoke a feeling of the infinite. So one might claim that we look out the night sky and realize it has no end. We look into two mirrors that are reflecting back at one another. We look to the horizon, or so on. The difficulty for these sorts of suggestions is that whatever may appear to us phenomenologically, it would seem that in none of the relevant cases can it literally be the case that we are directly encountering anything infinite qua infinitude, in sensory experience qua sensory experience. For, well, no doubt, these might be experiences that remind us of the infinite or that stir or provoke some pre-existing idea of the infinite in us. In each case, the stimulus is just too impoverished as a matter of empirical fact to actually be our source of the idea of the infinite. We know that sensory experience, qua sensory experience, is embodied in the finite mechanisms that are constituted by a large but finite number of nerves and sensory receptors in our nervous system when these interact with the finite environment. In sum, even if thought must begin in sensory experience in good Aristotelian fashion, something more is needed to explain how thought manages to get beyond there. And the infinite seems to be far beyond anything we do really encounter in sensation. A second straightforward response might note that experience needs to be considered more broadly as not merely constituted by sensory stimulation. On this count, we might note that our best science plausibly posits some actual examples of infinitudes that maybe in some way we do interact with. So one might note that space, time, black holes, or quantum renormalization events seem to involve infinitude. And the thought might be that provided we just think of these, we are thinking of something that is indeed infinite, and thus an adequate source of our thought of the infinite. This response seems deficient to me inasmuch as it seems to confuse our grasp that something is infinite with our grasping infinitude by thinking about that entity. For even granting that these objects exist and that we can interact with them in some way and that they are infinite, it still seems that our interactions with them are mediated by finite stimuli and that their infinitude is in fact a scientific postulate. They feature in theories that we construct, where the postulation and construction of such entities in such theories seems to presuppose that we already have a grasp of the infinite. So that we actively place infinitudes into our theories of the empirical world may indeed show that we can think infinitude, but it does not show how we are able to do so, which was my original question. Finally, one other straightforward attempt to diffuse the paradox, which is straightforward in the sense that it postulates a literal isomorphism between infinitude and the mind, would involve hypothesizing that the brain, though in one sense finite, being constituted of a finite number of nerves, still somehow might represent some extensive infinitude in a literal fashion. So perhaps the brain utilizes the supposed infinite divisibility of space or time. Or maybe the brain makes exotic use of quantum renormalization events in some way. Clearly, the deficiency of such a hypothetical proposal is simply that it's highly speculative, and it would depend upon substantive controversial assumptions in metaphysics, such as that space and time are in fact infinitely divisible, or it might depend upon assumptions regarding the nature of quantum renormalization, and so on. In point of fact, I've never encountered any such concrete proposals, and I would be very interested if anyone else has. I have nothing further to say by way of critique of this option, save that it might seem just odd to think that our brains might have evolved infinitude representing circuits in some respect. Still, I welcome any suggestions. If anybody should happen to know more about quantum computational neuroscience than myself. To conclude this section, then, it is hard to see how any straightforward satisfaction of the DCC will be forthcoming with respect to thought about the infinite. For all we know, there might be no real infinities in material nature at all, perhaps not even space and time. And even if there were something infinite, it is unclear how its likeness could, so to speak, have gotten into our heads, which seem, frankly, and no offense, too small to literally receive or represent the infinite, given our sensory and neurological limitations. I turn to more sophisticated attempts to reply to the paradox. Perhaps the problem in the previous responses was that they were characterized by the assumption that we must make a somewhat naive interpretation of the DCC. That is, one that presupposes some literal isomorphism between neural firings and, say, transfinite carbon. But perhaps, one might think, the resemblance or causation clauses of a plausible version of the DCC might be satisfied in more nuanced ways, such as to allow us to explain infinitary thought using only the finite resources uncontroversially available to a neurologically and spatio-temporally bounded mind. My contention will yet be that even these more sophisticated attempts to circumvent the paradox in the final analysis fail. Usually, the reason they fail is that the attempted representations of infinitude are too ambiguous to uniquely point to the infinite. Now, there are three basic lines of approach that I've encountered that I would characterize as nuanced in that sense. The first approach is to appeal to conventional symbols of the infinite as proxies. So consider that the word infinite is, after all, finite, but it might nonetheless represent the infinite perfectly well, one might think. Or consider some other symbolic gesture towards the infinite. Say, consider the series 1, 2, 3, followed by a ... We know what this means. We know that it gestures towards the infinite. And so it seems to provide us with an intelligible way in which we might be thinking the infinite. And of course, it is finite, and there's no mystery, it would seem, about how we can think 1, 2, 3, ... or a lemniscate, or the word infinity. The problem with this approach, of course, is that these are conventional symbols. Conventional symbols of infinitude, such as the word infinite or ... only in fact represent anything at all by contingent convention. Where convention means, where conventional meaning or intentionality seems to presuppose natural meaning or intentionality in the mind of the speaker. Whoever decided to represent the infinite using the lemniscate or ... must have already had some natural conception or apprehension or prolepsis, as it were, of the infinite in the first place. So this suggestion seems to not succeed. The second suggestion is that we think the infinite by way of thinking some non-conventional definition of the infinite, where this definition was constructed using only finitely many terms that refer to finite things. For example, one might think that we can access the infinite by characterizing it as the cardinality of any set that can be put into a one-to-one correspondence with a proper subset of itself. Or one might affirm that the infinite is, as its etymology implies, simply the not finite. In the words of Bertrand Russell, you understand the finite and you understand not. What do you not understand about not finite? I see at least three difficulties for this approach. First, definitions usually seem to presuppose that we have some independent access to what we are defining. And this seems true in the case of the infinite. Consider that if we did not already have access to the infinite, we would not have probably thought to generate a definition of it in the first place. And we would not be able to test the definition's fit to its object. Second, even granting that one could think of the infinite merely by thinking of a definition, it does not follow that this is in fact how human beings originally did, or even how most of them usually do, think of the infinite. Consider that when children come to think of the infinite, they never do so by noticing some innate definition of infinitude involving sets that can be placed into one-to-one correspondence with proper subsets themselves. It was a discovery by Dedekind that this is in fact a good definition of the extensively infinite. So our awareness of the infinite seems to precede our attempts to understand or axiomatize. And so there seems to be a capacity to be explained even if we can construct suitable finite proxies for our original objects of infinitary thought. Finally, one might argue that to grasp the various components of these definitions actually presupposes our grasp of the infinite, since the terms involved are in subtle ways infinitary. Consider the definition of the infinite as the not finite, or as that which cannot be put into one-to-one correspondence with any natural number. Such definitions seem to presuppose that I can understand finitude, which seems difficult in the absence of a contrast. Or, in the case of the definition involving the natural numbers, it seems we already know that the natural numbers cannot be exhaustive. In brief, if I must already have some infinitary cognitive capacity, such as to allow me to refer to universals or domains or to infinite sets and to understand them, it would seem that my definition is not in fact how I can think the infinite. It is in fact a product of my ability to think the infinite. To recapitulate the main point of this subsection, definitions of infinitude may feel like attractive explanations of our grasp of the infinite, but in hindsight, they are more likely to be its effects. We seem to have a free theoretical sense for the infinite, the possibility of which remains explained. Finally, one might think that the correct approach must in some way appeal to disposition. So there's a number of ways one might attempt to hash this dispositional approach out. For example, one might notice some recursively applicable procedure that we are able to perform or think about ad infinitum, such as division or addition. This seems to have been John Locke's approach, for example, to comprehending how we come to the idea of the infinite. He notes that for any given quantity, we notice that we can imagine more, and somehow this generates in us the idea of the infinite. So alternatively, one might claim that we have access to material bodies, which have a disposition qua bodies to continue forward along their world lines or along their geodesic ad infinitum. Thus, it might seem that in some sense we do have access to the infinite qua infinitary dispositions. Or one might appeal to our own utilization of universal concepts or to logical schemas. We might note that these can be instantiated infinitely many times, and that this kind of provides us a proxy understanding of the infinite in virtue of the dispositions of the things involved. In response to this dispositional approach, while I grant that such phenomena as addition or recursion or bodies continuing ad infinitum into the infinite future probably have something to do with our thinking of the infinite, the dispositional approach is not adequate, since knowing a disposition seems to presuppose knowing what it is a disposition towards. To know a disposition to be towards the infinite, it would seem that one must have already thought the infinite in some respect. Otherwise, the disposition's true nature seems to remain unknown or even indeterminate. For example, to know that a recursive procedure is indeed applicable ad infinitum, or that a certain repetitive process will continue forever, is not sufficient just to think the procedure or to perform the procedure. Even windmills can perform repetitive procedures that in principle might continue ad infinitum given enough time. It seems that what might be going on, or what might go on in examining such procedures, is that one searches for a limit to the procedure's applicability, or one considers the amount of time one has to perform the procedure, and one does not find a limit to these things. But even this seems to at most generate the negative conclusion that there is not a limit to the number of applications, and it does not seem obvious how this ought to generate the positive insight that the procedure can be applied to anything within a certain universal infinite domain. After all, it is easy to program machines that have dispositions to loop ad infinitum or that are proceeding to infinity in some sense, without these machines being really plausibly thought to think the infinite. I conclude that appeals to dispositions seem to fail, since the capacity to think the infinite dispositions in the first place, to know them as infinite dispositions, is no less mysterious than the problem of thinking the infinite itself. Indeed, it seems to just be an instance of the problem. Before concluding this section and turning to my positive proposal in the last section, I will turn to a general form of argument that one might offer against the possibility of any fully finite thing thinking the infinite using merely finite means. For something to represent the infinite by way of some analogical similarity, say by the words not finite or by a recursive procedure, seemingly the representation must not merely resemble the infinite, but must resemble it uniquely. Otherwise, there would be no reason for considering the representation a representation of the infinite rather than something else that is finite. and more similar to the representation than the infinite. Similarly, if the infinite is to causally influence a being, such as to give it a sort of access to the infinite by way of an efficient cause, the recipient must have the potentiality to receive the infinite in a unique way, and thus to absorb its contents, as it were, and to identify it as the source of the thought. But it seems that no finite thing will ever be capacious enough to receive or resemble the infinite more than it resembles or receives something that is finite. And thus it seems that no finite thing will ever be able to receive the infinite in its totality rather than merely receiving a finite part of it, which would constitute the actual content of any given thought or representation caused by the infinite. To conclude this section, it seems to me, to paraphrase James Franklin, that the gap between the finite and the infinite is unbridgeable by any resources from the side of the finite. The infinite, if it is to be reached at all, simply has to be swallowed whole. I now turn to the final section of this presentation. I have thus far suggested that we have, as yet, no good account of how the human mind is able to stretch itself such as to represent the infinite. But the preceding discussion presupposed something like a materialist account of the mind. Since the ability to think the infinite seems inexplicable using merely ordinary mathematical understandings of infinitude and ordinary naturalistic understandings of the mind, ordinary, of course, being a domain of discourse relative phrase, it may be worthwhile to consider other options. I offer that Aristotle's account of the mind, or something similar, as involving something purely actual and immaterial, combined with the scholastic notion of the qualitatively or intensively infinite, might provide us with a way forward. The brief thought I have is that if there is a part of the mind, let us call it the agent intellect, that is itself in some sense infinite, there might be a way to satisfy the DCC in relation to infinitary content. And I will suggest that such an account would actually provide us a more realistic account of how we actually do seem to think of infinite things. To explain my suggestion more adequately, I must say a few words about the concept of the intensively infinite and how it might be thought to relate to the notion of the extensively infinite. I take it that anything that is worthy of the name infinite must be in some way associated with the notions of greatness, perfection, or measurement, which I will leave undefined. Now, if one assumes that there is only one kind of greatness, namely the kind of greatness that characterizes quantity or number, with a plurality of time or space or material objects, and one assumes that there is only one proper way to measure any given greatness, namely by measuring pluralities of discrete units, then one will naturally tend to come to the conclusion that there is only one proper meaning of infinitude, namely the extensive one. Thus, one will follow John Locke in taking the extensively infinite to be the only proper non-metaphorical meaning of infinitude. But if one holds that there are different analogous meanings of greatness, and that not all measurement of greatness need involve appeal to discrete units, one might instead hold that there is a kind of infinitude implicit in the traditional notion of divine simplicity that is no less a true and literal sense of the infinite than the extensive one, indeed, which might be the prior and more intelligible sense. This sense would simply involve a measure of greatness that is different from that typically addressed in mathematics, always addressed in mathematics. To make clear what I'm gesturing towards here, consider that in the Aristotelian and scholastic traditions, not to mention the Platonic tradition, nature is typically conceived to be a hierarchical cosmos, in which beings higher in the scale of nature are characterized precisely by their greater degrees of simplicity and, as it were, compactness. Thus, according to St. Thomas, if I'm not mistaken, angels higher up in the hierarchy are greater precisely because they cognize fewer but more universal forms. How does this notion of the intensively infinite then, combined with the notion of the agent intellect, help us with the paradox of infinitary thought? My suggestion is that while we cannot plausibly be thought to grasp the extensively infinite in itself, at least not in the mode in which it might be thought to exist in nature or in an infinite set of objects, we can plausibly be thought to grasp the intensively infinite, provided there is an immaterial part of our mind, such as Aristotle takes there to be. Aristotle holds that the immaterial agent is purely active, that it is in a way all things, and that it is able to produce all forms of material things in the patient intellect. Perhaps then we know all that is extensively infinite by virtue of knowing the higher infinity that is able to produce and inform the extensively infinite. That is, by knowing the intensive infinitude that virtually or immanently contain any greatness of any finite perfection, we are capable of conceiving the infinite. On this point, I think it is worth remarking that St. Thomas imputes a kind of infinitude to the immaterial intellect, in that the intellect is in potency to being in general and is not limited in operation to knowing one or another species of corporeal being. Of course, perhaps we do not wish to say that the human intellect is intensively infinite in every possible sense of the word. Surely that is a prerogative of the divine. Yet even so, if there is some relative or maybe qualified sense in which the mind might participate in the unqualified, intensively infinite, that is the divine mind, such as to comprehend within itself in an inferior manner all that the divine mind can produce in material nature, one might well have the beginnings of a solution to the paradox of infinitary thought. I conclude this section by suggesting that the preceding is not only a good way to understand how infinitary thought is possible, but also a good description of how it actually works in practice. When we think about the infinite, we never actually have a sensory phantasm, say, that literally embodies a huge plurality like Alice Null. Likewise, when we think of the continuum, it seems we cannot literally visualize or intuit it as a collection of actually divided discrete parts, but rather we think of it as an undivided whole. It is infinitely superior to any point on the continuum. So we might think that it virtually or potentially contains an, a series that is extensively infinite, and that we grasp this only by recognizing its relative intensive or qualitative infinitude. So it seems, in brief, that what we actually do when thinking of the infinite is that we think about procedures, schemas, universals, or one might even say causes of mathematical objects, which we recognize to have unlimited fecundity. We recognize different kinds of mathematical objects, and we see which ones govern or participate in or are governed by others. And we have the insight that some objects might be unbounded in their potential, such as to virtually or immanently contain infinitely many other mathematical objects. And this seems to be just what we would expect if we were in fact accessing the extensively infinite using only our cognition of intensive infinity. Such concludes my suggestion, tentative as it is, about how an Aristotelian might begin to address the paradox of infinitary thought. I grant that there is much more to be said, and I look forward to your comments. And that concludes my presentation.
All right. Thanks, Greg. We're a little tight for time, but I think we have at least time for maybe two questions. So, who wants to go first? Yes, Andrew.
Unless there's somebody else. Um, it seemed to me, maybe I misunderstood that you said that universality cannot account for our understanding of infinitudes earlier in the talk, and then later on, you said our immateriality and having an intellect is where our understanding of infinitude comes from. That seems to be, at least in Aristotle and Aquinas' view, what's responsible also for our ability to think about universality. Like universality and infinitude do end up going together.
Mhm.
So do you in the end judge that maybe I misunderstood and you never contradicted this, but that universality you can't understand infinitude through universality?
That's a good objection, and that's something I think I will have to clarify. So, um, it seems to me prima facie that one might distinguish grasping a universal and grasping that it can be instantiated infinitely many times. Now, the reason it seems to me that there is this distinction is that I suppose, a universal in itself, if we conceive it to be simply a finite object, doesn't in itself involve the notion of infinite instantiability. So one might conceive, for example, a multiply instantiable essence that can only be instantiated 5 times. So it's like you might have, at least it's not clear what the logical contradiction is. You might have an essence that is fully present in at maximum 5 individuals. And you might fully grasp that essence, or maybe it can be instantiated a time corresponding to a number of times corresponding to Graham's number, or something like that. So it just seems to me that unless you attribute a sort of infinitude to the universal itself, you just don't get there you don't get to a grasp of the infinite simply from having a multiply instantiable schema or universal or essence or whatever. I grant that's a good objection, and I'm glad you brought it up though.
Thank you, thank you.
All right.
Father, I think it's your
Oh
Yep.
yes, thank you very much for your talk. Very, very interesting. I'm curious about a couple of things, particularly regarding to which act of the intellect is the one that is doing this knowing. So, are you referring to the abstraction, right? So, is it by some act of formal abstraction of the whole or of the part, right? That we are knowing infinity, or is it more of a part of the second act of the intellect, right? So combining and dividing and saying, for example, right, this is or is not finite or bounded or terminated in some fashion. So is it an act of judgment or is it an act of abstraction?
Hmm. At the top of my head, I don't have an opinion on that, and I would want to clarify in my own understanding um, how the intellect works um, when thinking about mathematical objects. I suppose I was thinking in terms of the first act of the mind, so an intuition, as it were. But I'm curious. Um, is there a reason to prefer one over the other that stands out prima facie?
So the main reason for the question is just to see what it is that you're claiming. So when you're claiming that, oh yes, we can know infinity, how is it that you're claiming that we can know infinity? And then the other reason is that, as we've seen already, there are, if we want to take sort of Aristotle's or Aquinas' or Avicenna's approach to abstraction of mathematicals, right? We're going to run into a problem because for Aristotle and for Aquinas, right, you can only there can only exist potential infinities, right? So both in the world, right, and even in mathematics in a certain sense. So if mathematicals are abstracted from real things, so then there's the question of, oh, so how is it that we can know these infinities?
Okay.
Yeah, is it by an act of
So
abstraction or a judgment?
right. Okay, that's a good question. I don't have a answer to it right now. So I'll confess to some degree. I mean, um, this discussion, I'm aiming at. So I primarily work in analytic philosophy, and I'm nudging my naturalistically inclined colleagues, hopefully a little bit more in an Aristotelian direction. So I don't have a complete account, um, but it is helpful to know that that's something I'll need to clarify. Thank you.